Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pivoting in Practice webinar focused on arts and culture. My name is Bianca Durrani. I'm president of Aperio Philanthropy. Aperio is delighted to be hosting this webinar series alongside the NYU SPS Haynes Center, and we are thrilled that you're here to join us today for a very important conversation. Aperio works with nonprofits large and small on developing fundraising programs that grow quickly and sustain their important work. And so we've been very focused lately on this question of pivoting and what does pivoting really look like now that we're months into talking about it and really starting to do it. Our panel today will bring you leaders from around the field of arts and culture to discuss what they learned, their successes, their mistakes, and what we can all take away from their experiences. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our co-host, Michelle DAmico from NYU. Michelle?
Great, thanks, Bianca. Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle DAmico, and I'm the Director for Public and Non-Credit Programs at the NYU School of Professional Studies Center for Global Affairs, or CGA. Events like these form a part of our efforts to prepare a community of informed global citizens to create and support positive change. We do this through our 2 graduate programs, an MS in Global Affairs and an MS in Global Conflict, Security, and Cybercrime, and our non-credit courses and certificates. We are also home to the George H. Hayman Program for Philanthropy and Fundraising. The Hayman Program offers professionals pathways to gain and deepen knowledge and skill sets within the philanthropic sector. Courses are taught by an expert team of faculty practitioners who bring deep insight and knowledge to the classroom. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to a member of our community, Lukas Haynes, who will be moderating today's conversation. Lukas is a long-standing member of the CGA family who taught both within the MS in Global Affairs program and the Hayman program. He has an impressive career in leading organizations working in the critical areas of climate change, human rights, economic equality, and international peace and security. He currently serves as the executive director for the David Rockefeller Fund. A final quick note before I turn this over to Lukas and today's panel, I'd like to encourage those of you who have questions to use the Q&A tool to submit them to us. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Lukas in today's panel for today's conversation. Go ahead, Lukas.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone for tuning into this special panel discussion. I'm excited to introduce our guests, and I will turn right to it. I want to begin with Randi Berry, the Executive Director of IndieSpace and the Indie Theater Fund. Both of these organizations serve the indie theater community with funding, professional development, and free real estate advisory services. During the pandemic, they have provided nearly 500 emergency grants to individual artists for food, rent, and medical expenses, and gave 13 venues unrestricted grants to help with their safe reopening plans and back rent payments. They also provided free support in negotiations with landlords, workshops with HVAC specialists and architects, and community care sessions to support artists' mental health during this very challenging time of crisis. Next, we have Yolanda F. Johnson, president of YFJ Consulting, LLC, founder of Women of Color in Fundraising and Philanthropy, founder of Allies in Action Membership Network, and the first African-American president of Women in Development New York. If that were not impressive enough leadership, she is also an active lyric soprano who has performed in opera, oratorio, and concert settings across the United States and abroad. She's a composer who is a member of the Random Access Music New Music Collective and on the roster of Westchester Chamber Soloists. She holds a degree in vocal performance from the University of Tulsa and a master's with fundraising focus from the University of Akron. In addition to serving on the advisory committees of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Yolanda sits on several nonprofit boards, including the Hudson River Museum, Lehman College Art Gallery, POW-HER New York, and the International Advisory Board of the Foundation for Post-Conflict Development. Next, we have Shaunda McDill, the Program Officer for Arts and Culture at the Heinz Endowments. She describes herself as a wife and bonus mom of 4 and new cane Corso puppy named Pepper Indigo McDill. She spent 3 years in philanthropy, but she maintains her active artist practice as founder and producer at Damascus Theater Collective. Shaunda earned her BA at Dartmouth and MFA at Yale School of Drama and studied playwriting with the late August Wilson before working at a vast array of theaters across the nation in California, Chicago, and New York. While in Pittsburgh, she has also produced the city's first Black Dance Festival and done national public relations for Broadway across America. And finally, we have Nathan Urbach. Nathan has consulted or worked for 5 different Lincoln Center organizations and currently serves as the Director of Development for the New York Philharmonic. He's worked on several 8- and 9-figure campaigns in fundraising in different capacities, and prior to moving into the sector, he served as the director of the Lindemann Young Artist Program. Nathan is on the board of Old Westbury Gardens and has been a guest speaker for Opera America and the League of American Orchestra as an expert on gift planning. So I'm going to start today's panel with a question for Randi. How are indie theater makers pivoting during this time of extraordinary change? And how do they need the funding community to respond accordingly?
Thanks for that question, Lucas. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you. Indie theater makers are constantly pivoting. This is not a new practice for them because they're often the most under-resourced artists working in the field. They have no choice to be rethinking and thinking again and pivoting again in their work. But during COVID, some of our venues have turned into food distribution hubs. We have theaters that are sewing their own masks, delivering them with a performance to audience members or members of their community. A lot of our artists have turned to Zoom performances and readings. And we're also finding that many of our organizations are creating opportunities for care or support, especially for our Black theater makers during this time. And towards the beginning of the pandemic, our Asian theater makers who are experiencing an uptick in racism and towards their community. As far as the funding community, I think indie theaters need to see funders show up in the way that they did at the beginning of this pandemic, which was in an urgent fashion with few barriers of entry, low impact applications, and unrestricted funding. The Indie Theater Fund was able to pivot very quickly and open an emergency fund the day the theaters closed. We started giving out money the next day because we're in deep connection with our community, and we knew we had 1 week before our artists may have, struggle to buy groceries or pay rent. So my hope is that the lessons that were learned and the reason why funders came to our organization in order to fund our community is that they'll take those lessons and remember that trust-based philanthropy is a really good thing. Listening to the needs of the community is a great thing, and trying to minimize those barriers. Most specifically, the budget minimums, I think, is what impacts our community the most. Budget minimums in order to access funding is a deal breaker for some, the most under-resourced and the most diverse group of artists in the city.
Randi, I'm glad you mentioned the budgetary thresholds that some funders consider when considering letters of inquiry and proposal. As a funder of the arts, which did pivot to general support during 2020 as a direct response to the pandemic, could you elaborate on some of the other barriers to entry that you and your partners have found over the years in terms of accessing, in particular, foundation support?
Sure, there's a lot of them. The fund actually wrote down a list of those barriers, and we created an organization around those barriers to try to challenge them every step of the way. So I think not offering general operating support to organizations with smaller budgets is key here. We all want to do work, so it's not necessary to fund the program, right? I mean, the whole idea is that we're going to create theater. So offering the flexibility of general operating support is huge. But another barrier is the relationships, the access, the ability to write the grant application, the fact that grant applications in itself, often indie theater makers are working at least one other job, but often 2 or 3 other jobs while trying to do their theater work. And so having an application that might take 30 to 40 hours to complete for one of those organizations, and then not having development staff, so they're writing it, and then the language isn't as competitive with another application that might have been finessed by, a development director, is a barrier. And relationships, right? I mean, I think I've built relationships with funders over time. That takes time, and there's a barrier to that access, right? So being in the room, being in the right circles matters. Yeah.
Indeed. Before I turn to Yolanda, I just want to commend you, Randi, for the work of the organizations in serving, some of the smallest budget organizations in the sector. Really important from our point of view at the David Rockefeller Fund. So Yolanda, if you're ready, let's turn to the fundraising side for a moment. What tactics and trends have you seen work for the broader fundraising and philanthropic communities that you think can be applied to the arts to achieve more impact and success during this crisis?
That's an excellent question and really important thing to consider right now. Just saying hello to everyone as well. I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to share some of my thoughts on this. And so I think that in this great pivot of 2020 is what I call it, we all really had to think very creatively and ultimately leave no stone unturned. You have to pivot really on a daily to weekly basis. We're in reactive mode, just making sure that we're communicating well internally and externally. Donor communication is key in this virtual realm. I call it getting to the heart of technology and making sure that you're finding those new and interesting ways. Some people, I had a phone call with someone and they were like, I looked for a Zoom link. I was like, is this really a phone call? Yes, it was. And they were thrilled by it because they just got to sit on the phone and chat for a few minutes. So I think just communicating really well with donors, keeping the records, having that sense of empathy and compassion as well, I think has been very important across the board because nonprofits have to remember that everyone has been impacted by the things that have happened this year. A lot of net worth has changed and donors are thinking differently. They're reprioritizing, they're giving strategy and just, what's most important to them. One of the other interesting things that I've seen is that this whole situation of the pandemic has made donors really reassess their legacy. We are all reminded now of our mortality in certain ways. And so they're really thinking about what message do they want to leave behind as well. So planned giving is another area that I think everyone should really be looking into and taking very seriously right now. And just redefining what it means to be a philanthropist. Now that comes, from both aspects of philanthropy and fundraising, but no longer are we really seeing things through the lens and the eyes of the typical white affluent person archetype. We're thinking of everyone, we're respecting everyone as philanthropists and as the work that they're doing for the common good. And so stewardship looks differently. Communication looks differently. We're thinking creatively about how we're communicating the services and the programs that we're providing. You have to think creatively, especially in the artistic space, but just how you are in touch with your donors and even the smaller level donors, because the world is now our oyster, right? It used to be the people who were just physically in proximity to you, but now you've got the entire globe through this camera right here. You have access to so many other people. And so I think what will be very interesting on the other side of all of this is how people continue that aspect of stewardship and staying in touch with people that they've had these, touch points with throughout this virtual realm. and just bringing them into the fold in a different way, and finding that way to celebrate together when all is said and done, and really be able to show them what you have to offer, and they get to experience it in a more sensory sort of way. So invite them to a performance, invite them to come out and see whatever it is. You got to make sure you stay in touch with everyone, and invite them along for the celebration when all is said and done. The other thing I would say is to diversify funding streams. So really look at your fundraising strategy and see where you have to make that pivot. If you got a lot of government funding, but now you need to look more toward individual giving, if you need to make a different strategy for major gifts versus anything else. And don't be afraid, if you're communicating well with your donors, don't be afraid to ask them to unrestrict their funds. That is something, a beautiful flexibility that I'm seeing in this whole realm. They may have given you funds for a very particular specific thing to happen at a specific time and place, but now they're like, keep the lights on. And so you've got to take that and run with it. So I know that's a lot, but I think it all boils down to creativity, pivoting, positive reactive mode. You know that things can change from day to day, and that's why it's important to have good communication with your stakeholders and internally as well, because you may have to make a split-second decision that really impacts your organization.
As a longtime grant maker who frequently fields requests to reallocate or repurpose grant monies, I can affirm your last point about keeping in touch and being proactive about sharing the evolving needs of the organization and not underestimating the willingness, especially now, of grant makers to be flexible with repurposing and reallocation. I'd love to hear more about, various forms of stewardship that you've seen, but perhaps an easier question just here at the moment, because planned giving, is a new tactic for many organizations, especially smaller ones. What's a good first step for an organization who wants to learn more about planned giving and setting up a planned giving program?
Well, I would say get in touch with an expert. It is something that does require a certain level of expertise. You want to make sure that you do it correctly. But as with all things fundraising, you have to do really your own little personal feasibility study, right? You have to see and do the analysis and know if you have the people there to really pursue that, and if that's something you should really invest in. So take a good look at the donor base. One pain point that I've seen across the board is record keeping. So try to keep those donor records. Take the 5 minutes after a conversation and type in the notes, and just know who you are working with so you know what will work for them, and then get a professional and some expertise involved, and then develop a strategy and go for it.
Yolanda, thank you so much. You remind me when you talk about keeping in touch of one of my favorite stories in fundraising. A very large nonprofit in the civil liberties arena came in to report on a grant and told this story about how the executive director had begun to sort of look down the list of longtime recurring donors to see if there were, donors that might be contacted, to possibly step up their giving. And this led to a conversation with the donor in person, in which the donor, who had been writing probably, if I recall, high three-figure checks to the organization, said to the executive director, "I've been waiting for you to show up for 20 years.
Oh.
And the conversation subsequently led to one of the largest single gifts the organization had ever received, in the 7 figures. And it's a wonderful example not to underestimate anybody on that contributor list, and a little extra outreach can actually make a huge difference in the long run, especially if you look at those contributors who are very steady and very loyal and obviously committed to the cause. So, sorry.
I was just agreeing with you.
Hi, Shaunda. I want to apologize for a typo in my introduction. It is a McDill, correct?
That's right. Thank you.
Great to have you with us. So what do you see on the foundation side as the current opportunity to reimagine how we distribute funds as grant makers, how art is made at this time, of scarcity, and how we interact with one another as funders, as art makers, as citizens? And do you see urgency in the moment after months now of so much social change and challenge to the art sector?
I love that question. I'm going to start with what I think is the easiest, which is artists are going to always make art. So I think that the reality is that regardless of the scarcity that has always existed, it's just been deepened and heightened during this moment. I never try to say, oh, there'll be an increase or an influx. I'm seeing a lot of ways in which even local organizations here in Pittsburgh are changing the way, they're pivoting the way that they do things. And City Theater was just mentioned in the New York Times here in Pittsburgh. They have an outdoor theater festival. I just watched Frankenstein at their drive-in with my kids. And so they're finding ways, right? It's not applause, it's the honking of horns. The other piece that I would say around that question is I would decenter the organizations and artists from the pivot point and put philanthropy at the person that needs to be pivoting. So we have the ball and we need to be pivoting. And that's really the observation that I have. There's a great opportunity to not try and figure out what constitutes success for the artists, the arts collectives, and the organizations, but rather take the time to really understand what constitutes real need. And I think that we haven't necessarily done the work we need to around prioritization sometimes inside philanthropy. And so we want to be everything to everyone, but the funds are limited. A lot of times foundations are not going to touch their corpus, so they're not drawing down additional funds. So we're working with a finite amount of resources in most cases. So I would also offer that while the ball is also proverbial balls in our court to pivot, I would also say a colleague of mine, Kaisha Johnson, once mentioned, she's the founder of Women of Color in the Arts, and I'm a member of that group, as well as Yolanda's wonderful group, Women of Color in Philanthropy and Fundraising. She once mentioned that someone said to her, a dancer, when you're pivoting, you're actually staying in the same place, right? So what I would offer is that we need to move from just pivoting to also moving forward, being innovative, figuring out new ways, and not just put that onus on those who we serve, but on the institutions that for far too long have been doing the same things and calling it reimagining.
I really could not agree more with everything you said. And in our conversation before this webinar, you gave a great example of a relatively modest change in practice at your organization. Do you care to elaborate on that example that led to a larger number of small grants?
Sure. A part of my portfolio is Advancing Black Arts in Pittsburgh initiative that I co-manage with Celeste Smith at the Pittsburgh Foundation, and am honored to do that work with her alongside Jessica Gaynell Moss, a philanthropy fellow. And basically we realized in Advancing Black Arts in particular, it's already only 6% of the entire portfolio. And we had an 85% rejection rate every year. And so this was not the year, one, just in terms of humanity, to have anyone get a rejection letter in the mail, right? We felt, particularly not in Pittsburgh, where there's such a stark contrast to the ways in which African Americans live in this city and the economic disparity, and it being deemed the worst place to live for Black people in the nation, right? Particularly Black women. So for that reason, we were like, how can we change this? And we actually went from 85% rejection rate to a 0% rejection rate, because we decided to listen to the panelists who were people in the field who said, well, let's fully award the grants that we would normally award. But if we have some extra resources, let's just give $500 grants to everyone. So we did the math during that panel to figure out what is the amount, the maximum we could give so that no one walked away with nothing. And so that was $500 grants. And so it cost, the foundation $42,000, which sometimes is one grant or less than one grant to a single institution. But the impact in the field was tremendous and people really appreciated it. And so that's one example of the ways in which we pivoted in this moment.
Thank you very much. And not to put your foundation on the spot, but I'll talk about a couple of changes really that David Rockefeller Fund has made over the years. For a long time, the arts program budget had received slightly less than the criminal justice reform and the climate change solutions programs. And I think it was largely, it was before my time, but due to the fact that some trustees were much more vocal about the urgency of climate crisis and the sort of acute human impacts of mass incarceration on that population. And after a retreat of the board and a more sort of values neutral discussion about the value of all of the things the foundation was supporting, it made the decision to put arts on an equal funding basis with those other two core programs. And I think the statement that makes as a funder in conversation with other funders in particular is really important, because it's almost impossible to weigh, the relative value, the relative importance or urgency of so many of the issues that foundations support. And then this year, in fact, at the spring board meeting, the board made the very bold decision, I thought, to increase the spending rate for 2020 to 12.5% from the 5% norm that is prevails in foundations. And on top of that, individual trustees responded to the various crises facing incarcerated and detained communities and climate advocates and arts organizations by adding their own individual contributions. So when all is said and done, the David Rockefeller Fund will have paid out about 15% of its endowment by the end of 2020. And I'm happy for you to share that with your funding colleagues, because I think we just, to your point, we need to be advocates among ourselves for a real change in the way foundations do what they do at moments like this, and in general. So turning to Nathan, through your lens as a fundraiser for a really marquee cultural institution, how has the Philharmonic been able to expand its presence at a time when obviously audience congregating, for performances in the conventional way has been so constrained by the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Lukas, and thank you for this opportunity for being here. I really think I'm going to echo a lot of what Yolanda said in terms of strategy, and that the Philharmonic is implementing at the moment. And really, the first and foremost is staying engaged with our donors and our subscribers and our community. And we have this opportunity because we are not gathering in a hall or in a theater. We are not going to a building of brick and mortar. We are living in a new environment. And so for the Philharmonic, where we would plan years in advance, right now we have to be more nimble and agile. And so our programming and the way in which we engage with our donors can be really more responsive to what's happening at the moment, and we can have much further outreach. Two programs that we launched so that we could be in front of our audience and engage with the community. As an organization that's 178 years old, we want to be a neighbor to everyone. And so in August, we launched Bandwagon. And if you live here in New York City, it may have rolled up into your neighborhood. But this was a way in which we could engage our musicians with our audiences and partner with organizations that we haven't had the opportunity to partner with before. With Restoration Brooklyn, the Taiwan Center, National Black Theater, and the Public partnered with Anthony and our musicians, Anthony Roth Costanza and our musicians on this Bandwagon initiative. Although we couldn't tell our donors and our community where the bandwagon was rolling up, we were allowed and we were able to virtual events and through communications, as Yolanda said, through stewardship and through just communicating on telephone calls or emails, really share the stories and personal stories that we were hearing from really driving around the city. So for us, not really being in the hall, I think has been an opportunity for us that we really have taken and moved forward with and pushed through with. Thank you.
That's a really impressive response. And I'm gonna pose the same question to all of our panelists, but I'll start with you, Nathan, because I'm sure you're asked by your colleagues to project out into the future a little bit. What does 2021 look like from where you're sitting? And have you had signals from major donors or foundations, that give you cause for even more concern or even some optimism about what next year might hold?
Absolutely. So I mean, last week, like the Metropolitan Opera and Broadway, we announced that we would not continue performances in January. So when that shoe dropped, we knew that we had to be out in front of it with many of our donors. I think this conversation that we're all having right now is the importance of supporting general operating, keeping those lights on. It's important for all of us and not just directing funds to specific programs, which might not be able to be realized in this current landscape. And so I like to think about it in two ways: in support of us bridging this year and moving forward. And I like to think of all my kind of fundraising asks as it's not an or campaign. Would you give to an emergency fund or would you give to us this year? It's more of an and. Can you renew your gift and can you support us in this enhanced way so that you can help bridge this organization during this challenging year? And to Yolanda's point, it's being empathetic and understanding that everyone has been impacted, what has happened over the past 7 to 8 months around the world. And so being very conscientious of that as well.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm going to turn that same question to Randi, if you care to look ahead at a very different end of the cultural spectrum in terms of the budget of much smaller organizations. What are your concerns about 2021 and what are the concerns you're hearing?
I have a lot of concerns. I do want to point out one moment of hope or appreciation is that we're seeing an unprecedented investment in our BIPOC-led arts organizations. It's historic, and with the Cultural Treasures program that just came out, although I'd like to see more of that trickle down to our smaller organizations as well. But these programs are giving me hope that funders are having this type of conversation. I'm extremely concerned. I'm concerned without an additional federal relief package for our individual artists. I'm concerned about our venues without any rent relief coming down from the state or federal government. I mean, I think we'll see what happens after the election, whether or not some of that, if Save Our Stages is passed. I don't know if you know about that legislation. And so, I've already seen, I think it's as of today, there's 8 venues in our, sector that have already closed permanently. And without coalition building and merging and working together, sharing resources, I'm concerned. Yeah.
And as longtime funders of the arts, especially smaller budget organizations in New York City, we share your concerns. That's one reason we, as a foundation, made a first ever 501c4 grant to Americans for the Arts for its advocacy to unlock more government resource to support and in fact rescue arts organizations during this economic crisis is really the only word for it. And that's something that other foundation program officers who might be joining this webinar should know, that it's poorly understood, but private foundations can make charitable 501c4 tax deductible grants to 501c4s without crossing the IRS regulatory line that prohibits certain types of funding for lobbying by C3s and political activity by C4s. And we thought it was really important to lean into as much advocacy for national, state, and local arts funding as possible with that support to Americans for the Arts. But I want to end, on the positive note that you flagged, Randi, because, again, in a response to the social movement that arose after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's deaths, the David Rockefeller Fund Board felt it was absolutely essential and urgent to really focus grant-making criteria on BIPOC-led organizations across all of our programs. And our fall docket, as well as summer grants, will reflect that. So in crisis, there can be opportunity. And I think, so far at least, I see some of the same signs of change in that direction as well.
So long as there's that willingness, right, to look at ourselves and make the pivot in the moment and not wait 5 years, 10 years to talk about it over and over again without just making moves and moving forward, which is a positive that's come out of this pandemic, I think. Absolutely.
The time is now, long past due for these types of changes. Yolanda, do you care to look ahead to 2021 and offer some broad thoughts?
Sure. On some of my social media, I actually put something up that said, let's be honest, in 2015, where did you say you'd be in 5 years? Not here necessarily with what's going on. And yet we continue to move forward. The nature of the world is that it keeps turning and it keeps moving forward. So I would say that in 2021, we're going to have a few different stopping points. I think the election and legislation are obviously and clearly going to have an impact on how things move forward. So I already, this week alone, I have a program tomorrow on looking at different financial outcomes for nonprofits according to who wins the election. And so I think we have to be thinking about that. You don't have a crystal ball, but just be thinking ahead, making sure that your board finance committees, if you have them, are staying on top of things, or staying in touch with financial advisors just about, and I would say be very conservative right now as far as that's concerned. And then just reimagining. So to the points that all of you have made, I don't think we're ever going to be entirely the same again. This is going to be something, it's going to be a world reimagined. And so we'll look ahead and just embrace, all of the new things that are coming our way. And that way we don't check a box for, the racial equity movement, for gender equity. It means things are actually changing. The fabric of our society and of the arts sector, it's actually changing. So let's embrace that and continue to move it forward. I think having a plan according to whatever transpires, and communicating that clearly to donors is going to be really important. So we all know that we're in this together. We all know that nobody really knows what's happening, on a day-by-day basis, to be honest. But what we can do is plan as best we can in a realistic way and let your donors know that that you are solid in that way, that they can count on you to continue your mission in whatever way it looks. It may start to look differently for a while, but that you're going to keep that work moving forward. And I think that'll bode very well for arts organizations, just for the constituents and the donors to know that you're not giving up. And then to Randi's point, just that sense of camaraderie and collaboration, I think, is going to be really important. Again, remembering that we're in this together. And to your point, Lukas, legislation. In a week or so, WOKE is doing a program on legislation as a tool for racial equity, where we're really going to be diving deep. Megan Ming Francis, a speaker on that panel, said movements need money. And so, just thinking about how to advocate, staying aware of different things and making sure that's part of every arts organization's fundamental strategy moving forward, because it's going to be really important to be heard.
Hear, hear. Advocacy funding is central to all of our programs at the DR Fund, and we continue to think it is the ultimate leverage for foundations. So if you're not doing it, consider doing at least a little bit of it. So before we return to the queue of questions that's coming in from the audience, Shaunda, last word on 2021?
All of the early indicators say it's going to be a much tougher year in 2021 for our arts organization than this year was. A lot of the organizations and artists had some reserves, some ability to manage till the end of the year. We were able to provide some funding based on burn rates that we were told through the end of the year. But the reality is that even the foundation funding is strained at this point, right? So you see all of these kind of like initiatives that are popping up to be able to help people in the short term, but there are two kind of ways that I think about that, which is number one, that money, sometimes at the foundation, we're trying to hold some reserve so that we can go the distance, but then you're trying to parse an unknown future and you don't know what that distance looks like, right? To Yolanda's point, you don't know how long we're going to be here. And so we're trying to strategize in terms of those investments. The other part that I really would be remiss not to mention is that I think I love the optimism Yolanda brought to the table, because I think it looks bright if we are able to kind of do what Randi said, which is truly think about how we work, to truly be innovative, not forcing inauthentic collaborations, but to really encourage one of the principles that I know you have at your foundation, like self-awareness. And I think going into this pandemic, there are often organizations who were not held accountable or asked to be self-aware, right? And so when I talk about figuring out what constitutes real need, some of the conversation, there's a difference between organizations that have an endowment and those that never ever had an endowment, right? Or those who have continuously struggled to pay themselves, and those who've had 50, 100, 200 people on staff. I don't want to see anybody lose their jobs. So it's not pitting against one another. And I think that's something we have to really think about. But we do have to be transparent, and we have to take some risks, and our work moves at the speed of trust. So that's not just trust from who we're granting to us, it's us trusting maybe people, organizations that we are not traditionally funding. And that's a whole nother piece to 2021 that I think will make a change.
All very wise words. And I would just extend your point about risk-taking to foundation boards. We made a 1-year spending rate decision in the spring, and the spending rate is high on the agenda for our fall board meeting and a board retreat this winter. And some are always thinking about the long-term future and unforeseen needs. Others on the board, would argue that this is the rainy day. This is what endowments are for, moments like this. And we have no reason to think that, at this point at least, with the back and forth negotiations over COVID stimulus, that at least the beginning of 2021 will be very different than 2020 on the economic horizon. So thank you all for a rich set of reflections and thoughts looking forward. Our first question is for Nathan, I think. We are a small community orchestra. So what does, quote, out there with your donors look like and mean? What are the reactions of people when you are out there, and what do you anticipate doing next year?
So out there, I think, means in this environment. For a while, it was just phone calls and emails and Zoom meetings, and meeting people face to face via our computers. And then when we saw that there was fatigue setting in, and I think we've all witnessed this, that you go from one Zoom appointment to the next, thinking of other ways in which we can just engage, whether that's sharing an archival piece of content that we have, or it's creating something new with 2 musicians, or recording something, or even writing something, or having something from the musicians in your orchestra create a small piece, whether it's written or musical, that can be sent out. And I think really the most important part is to have it be, as everyone is saying, authentic and meaningful. And on whatever scale that you can do, go for it, try it. I think right now, people are in a lot of ways, they just want to connect with other people. We're missing one thing, and that's the shared experience of what art and culture brings. And so if we can find ways to do that in any of the resources that we have at the moment, I think that's the way forward for any size organization. And I know that we're doing that at the Philharmonic.
Thank you, Nathan. And I'll flag a news story from yesterday in New York about how a group, I think it was called Dancers of NYCB, New York City Ballet, staged a rooftop performance as a newly formed nonprofit for other dancers, I believe, in their field and their needs. And it was a wonderful example of, an innovative performance space, and responding to needs in their own community, and appealing to audiences who both want to see dance however they can, but also may share the same concerns that these dancers do for affected artists at this time.
And Lukas, just one more point. I think don't underestimate your social media channels and the outreach that has.
Great point. Our next question, I think, could go to anybody, but why don't I have ask Shaunda and Randi to think about it from two different perspectives. How are you engaging your boards in new and different ways at this time? Randi, do you want to start?
Oh, I was passing it to Shaunda if she wanted to start, but I can. I've been engaging my board way more frequently is the answer. At one point at the beginning of the pandemic, we were meeting weekly to try to respond in the moment to the needs that were arising and the issues we were running into, right? Like at the beginning, we were giving funding out as soon as we were receiving applications. Then we realized that mostly white, able-bodied people were submitting applications first. So in the middle of our process, we had to pivot and say, we're prioritizing BIPOC, disabled, immigrant artists. We also noticed that BIPOC artists were asking for less in their applications than white artists. White artists were asking for the full amount. So we also pivoted to give the full amount regardless of what was asked to all BIPOC applicants, whether they asked for it or not. So we're engaging quickly, and we're also having our board engage with our community, which I think is interesting. We've been having community forums fairly regularly to have the community weigh in on what we're putting money towards right now, which I think will develop a reparations program based on that, like collectively with our members. So I would suggest reminding them what their specific interests are and how it relates to what the emergency of the day is, because it has felt like an emergency of the day, and then having them engage directly with the community so that they're constantly experiencing, right, the benefits that, our community is grateful for what we're doing. And so our board then gets to receive that directly from the community rather than it being through me. And it inspires additional investment from the board, both as far as work and their own finances. So
I loved everything about what Randi is saying and the work that she's doing. I would answer immediately in 3 different ways. One, I just got off of a board meeting right before I came here. So when you asked that question, I needed a moment to just gather my thoughts. I think I don't often have to meet with the board. So that happens probably twice a year at the Heinz Endowments, where I'm part of the team that's in those board meetings. I did have to present and often do. And what I try to do as a program officer is tell the truth. So I think that, I say that and it's not simple. I think sometimes when you have an agenda and a strategy as an organization, there can be this perceived disconnect between the board and the staff. But what I try to do is translate and also be really clear about the work that is being done, celebrate the successes and communicate that clearly, and then also tie it back to what they've said in the values, right? The Heinz family and where it started. I mean, when you think about Heinz ketchup in the clear bottles, it was said, you know, by Teresa Heinz, because what you see is what you get, right? And that's why the clear bottles. So I try to always tie it back to the core of why, you know, we're doing what we're doing at Heinz. The arts and culture portfolio was one of the first, because it was a means by which economic development was going to transform downtown Pittsburgh, which it did. And so I try to point back to that. The last part, I've also seen a lot of organizations holding funder sessions. So there's a group here, Hill Dance Academy Theater. We were on a call where they gathered the funders and asked us to sit in and listen to what was happening. So I was more than happy to do that. We're always asking them to participate in ideation sessions, paid and unpaid. So I was more than happy to spend my time to listen. And then the last thing that I would offer is I think it's a great time for nonprofits to be building their boards. Everyone put out a statement, all the way from the top Fortune 500 companies down to the smallest company. If you have a Black Lives Matter statement, if you have a statement about the importance of arts and culture in society, I think nonprofit leaders should be challenging, writing letters. I love that statement on your website. We're looking for board members to diversify, you know, our board, or to bring in different revenue that we're not used to accessing as a BIPOC organization or otherwise. I know the last part of that is in Pittsburgh, corporate funding is dismal. And that's probably because of the strong foundation history. So I feel like this is a time, there are a lot of great corporations in Pittsburgh, and it's the time to really make the requests that are needed.
I love both sets of responses, and just to speak briefly about what I've asked our board, it's to expedite the identification and election of BIPOC leaders, especially from the grassroots, to our board. And I'm happy to report that we've doubled the number, and we're headed to 20% very shortly. We're running out of time, so I'm going to bundle the next couple of questions. And really for anybody, but maybe Yolanda, you might have some thoughts. Are there partnerships that can be beneficial to arts organizations to supplement fundraising capacity and reach new donors?
Well, I think that anytime you do participate in a partnership, make sure that the terms of the partnership include that you will be able to then, you know, no one's going to give you, privacy policies still exist, especially in this virtual realm. Cybersecurity is a real thing. But as far as broadening your audience, why not? You know, if it makes sense to partner with an organization, just make sure the terms of the partnership include the fact that whatever registrants come from that event, you'll be able to keep and then reach out to them in post-event communications. I've seen that be an impactful tool. And then I just think that, again, being very strategic about your partnerships, because partnerships also take a lot of work. And so you just want to make sure that you have a strategy in mind. What exactly are you trying to gain from it? And I think probably the most concrete thing you can gain is access to new people, and then giving them that opportunity to stay in touch with you. You know, after, typically it would be an event or a program. Dip the toe in first just to see how things work with another organization, and just be very clear and transparent from the get-go about how things will operate later. And I think that that's a very solid tool to be used right now.
Thank you. I was inspired this week to find the Public Theater here in New York, one of our grantees, you know, with their major gala effort, which was last night, or began last night because it's streaming for free online all week. They made the decision to share revenue with a number of community-based partners that they work with through the Public Works program. And I don't know how that idea arose, honestly, but it led me to think that maybe there are approaches to be made by small community arts groups to bigger ones to propose some sort of collaborative presentation and gala event for revenue sharing. So our next question, and this may be the last, any suggestions on how to best follow up with an influx of new small donors who've responded since the start of the pandemic?
Sure.
I hope you have this problem.
We're working on it at the moment. And I really remember this from my time working in independent schools, when there are kindergartners and their families coming in to the schools. They would gather all the parents together to talk to them about, this is our mission, this is who we are, and this is what's happening at the in our environment, and to answer any questions. So we are going to be kicking off just some welcome kind of coffee and conversations on a bi-monthly basis with our new donors to, as I think we're all saying here, be transparent as possible. And from, you know, a $5 gift to a $10,000 gift, we want everyone to feel that they're part of the New York Philharmonic family. So that, I think, is just a very simple way to continue and to engage and to be transparent with everyone who's donating.
And if I can just piggyback onto that from Nathan, what's really impactful now in this virtual realm is finding a way for the senses to meet the technology. And so what I've seen be really impactful is whenever you are in touch with those smaller donors or whomever else, and you do an event like that, send them something. You know, send them a little thing of coffee and say, drink this with us as we all come together. That is just fun. It's really interesting. On one of the boards that I serve on, the exhibition was about African Americans and water. And so they sent beach towels, you know, and then everyone engaged on their social media. So that engagement through the social media, through just the tiniest little things, whenever you're bringing all of the smaller level donors together, can really make a difference, and they'll feel more engaged.
Well, I think we've run to the end of our allotted time, but on behalf of the organizers and NYU, I want to thank all of you for all the time you gave out of your busy schedules to this webinar and to preparing for it. And I hope it was of value and actually leaves our audience with some ideas and optimism about what the future may hold for their fundraising and stewardship in the arts. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel with all four of you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.